I often encounter online claims that Britain was Orthodox. This sentiment is often raised by ethnically English converts who convert to the modern Orthodox Church in order to get some sort of historical justification for their conversion. It's a sort of returning home, an alignment of worship with their ancestors. But as a Roman Catholic myself, this claim was always a bit odd to me. What on earth did these guys mean by Britain was Orthodox? Merely being in communion with the pre-schism church? By that token, so was Rome, and she's never left the church. Others have left her. It just seems odd. Now, the other day I encountered this video by a British Orthodox convert by the name of Euan Michael. His video was titled Britain's Orthodox Christian Roots. In this video, Euan makes several claims, each aimed at proving his thesis. That thesis being that Britain was historically Orthodox. But are these claims correct? I aim to address this by using his video as a way to pivot towards proving a contrary thesis. That Britain was solidly and firmly Western and would be far more theologically comfortable with the Roman Church of today than the Eastern Orthodox Church of today. Now, to preface this video, I don't mean to disparage or attack Euan for his heartfelt conversion to Eastern Orthodoxy. As in writing and filming the script, Euan has uploaded what appears to be like the first of many testimonies as to why he's become Orthodox. It's just his first video here. And it's a beautiful testimony. Euan appears to be a lovely person discerning Christ, and as a revert myself to Catholicism though, I can sympathise and praise Euan's zeal for Christ. As a Catholic, I'm overjoyed at seeing his conversion. I'd much rather the world become Eastern Orthodox, mind you, than Protestant, even if that's High Church Protestant, because Eastern Orthodoxy has the sacraments, whereas the Protestants do not. But nevertheless, I do pray that this man remains nourished in Christ and grows close to him each day. I do still think it's important that we critically analyse the claims he makes in his video. So I understand he's got this zeal, but I think we still need to see whether this zeal is well placed, so to speak. Not necessarily his zeal for Christ, but his zeal for an Orthodox Britain. But without further ado, let's get into this video.
If you ask people in the UK what Christianity looks like in Britain, you'll probably get a very varied set of images. These days there are so many options in this country for whatever flavour of Christianity you fancy. But what almost no one imagines is the Christianity that actually shaped Britain for the first 10 centuries of its Christian history. Before the familiar landscape of medieval Catholicism, and long before the Catholic-Protestant clashes that dominate school textbooks.
Okay, we'll stop it right there. So, I apologise for my chest working as well, by the way. So, first 20 or so seconds, Euan claims that, unlike what the school textbooks will claim, one kind of Christianity shaped Britain for the first 10 decades of Christian history. The implication being from the title of the video, and as we'll see later, is that this Christianity, this form of Christianity I should say, is Orthodoxy. By Orthodoxy he means Eastern Orthodoxy, not, I suspect he does mean Oriental Orthodoxy. Everything I've seen of him, he's in a Byzantine liturgy, so probably not Eastern Orthodox. Not Oriental Orthodoxy, but he's implying that the church was Eastern Orthodox. The Eastern Orthodox Church as a continuum with this pre-schism British Church.
Centuries of its Christian history. Before the familiar landscape of medieval Catholicism, and long before the Catholic-Protestant clashes that dominate school textbooks.
Now, I've just rehashed that. I should also say, I have a script in front of me. This isn't a first time reaction. I don't want to give that impression. I've done research. So Euan just noted that he's absolutely certain that the Christianity in the First Millennium English Church, the British Church, but I use that term interchangeably. He's absolutely certain that it's not medieval Catholicism. Now, what this medieval Catholicism looks like to him, I'm not certain. He doesn't really define it, he just sort of says it's not medieval Catholic. For me, I would say, medieval Catholicism, when I think of it, just in my imagination, it's like monks with tonsures, bald spots. There's more theologically, there's the belief in the filioque, the belief that in the eternal procession of the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son as one spiration, I should clarify. Also, another mark, I think, of medieval Catholicism, I think most people would agree, is the veneration of the Pope and following the Pope effectively. Another thing, unleavened Eucharist, a Roman adjacent liturgy, especially with the use of Latin in the liturgy, using a Roman calendar for the saints and whatnot, and how they order their liturgical year, and other such aesthetical and visible signs. I'm going to let this video play out as well. I don't want to chop and change it so it sounds like I'm editing his words or anything. So we'll continue from where I left off.
Britain belonged to the undivided conciliar sacramental church of the First Millennium. Britain was in every meaningful way Orthodox.
So before I get into that, it's probably a smart idea to say what I don't mean. I'm not saying that Britain used to be Greek or Russian, or that everyone here in the early centuries was keeping the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom in the exact same form that you'd find on Mount Athos today. What I am saying is something in a way more profound. When I say that Britain was Orthodox, I mean that the first Christian communities in these islands belonged to the same undivided church that we now call Orthodox.
Okay, so I think to begin with, that's a very valid point, and I think it's quite humble and honest to admit that. And he's also correct in saying it, which is outright. He's correct in saying that the liturgy in pre-schism Britain, First Millennium Britain, was not Greek or Russian. It wasn't a Byzantine liturgy. The British Arles almost certainly did not use the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom for that first 1,000 years. I can get into that later, but for now, I agree with them.
In faith, in worship, and in spiritual outlook, and that they were shaped not only by Rome, but also very clearly by the Christian East.
This is a sort of an odd point. The notion that Britain belonged to the Church of the First Millennium isn't exactly a disputed thing. I don't think I've ever met anyone who says Britain was some sort of schismatic enclave somewhere off in the North Sea doing its own thing. I don't think I've ever met anyone who said that. It seems like a really just null point to make. Oh, Britain was part of the First Millennium Church. Yeah, so was Rome. Are you going to say the Roman Church was actually Orthodox for the first 1,000 years? Which I know a lot of Orthodox would agree, but it seems like a redundant point to make. You're not proving anything by saying, oh, it was part of the same church. By that same token, I can say, oh, well, Greece was Catholic because it's part of the same as the Catholic Church for 1,000 years. Or Constantinople was Catholic. Alexandria was Catholic. Antioch was Catholic. It's just it's sort of a weird point to make. I don't understand why he makes that point. The second thing that he says there is that he does acknowledge, admittedly, that Britain's Christianity was shaped in faith, worship, and spiritual outlook by Rome. He also says it was nourished by this Christian nation. That's not an incorrect statement, as I'll get into later.
So let's unpack that. First, in the simplest sense, any Christian community in Britain before the Great Schism of 1054 is by definition part of what we now call the Orthodox Church.
Okay, I'll address this. But this graphic is really odd. This chart he's using. Now, I understand church history timelines aren't particularly neat, and you can't really do an unbiased one, really, because if I as a Catholic did it, you'd just be the Catholic Church as a straight line, and then you've got the Eastern Orthodox come off, the Nestorians coming off, the Miaphysites coming off, Protestants going off, and then splintering off into a million things. Obviously, I'd be biased. Every church history timeline's biased, but this one's just incredibly odd. Now, I assume this one's Eastern Orthodox, the original designers were Eastern Orthodox, and further, I think it's Ukrainian and Russian because you can see just at 988 it talks about the conversion of the conversion of Kiev. And then in 1988, it mentions 1,000 years of Orthodoxy in Kiev. It uses the Ukrainian spelling for Kiev, so I imagine it's the Ukrainian one. But what it does include and doesn't include is really odd because it's got Great Schism, Sack of Constantinople, Gregory Palamas. That's obviously important for Orthodoxy. Fall of Constantinople. But then there's nothing between 1453 and 1782. That seems really odd. I'm not Orthodox, but the Synod of Jerusalem was held in 1672, and this is where this was basically the first major gathering, pan-Orthodox synod, and it was basically done to address Protestantism. It's almost like the Council of Trent, effectively. At this council, metausis was proclaimed, that is the teaching of the Eucharist, which is Medieus being the Greek for the Latin transubstantiation. And it also decried sola scriptura, faith alone, other stuff like that. Another thing that missing from this graph, especially if it's a Ukrainian Russian one, it doesn't mention the Old Believer Schism or the liturgical reforms of Patriarch Nikon between 1652 and 1666. But for some reason it includes the 1794 arrival of Orthodoxy into Alaska and the 1871 mission in Japan. I'm not sure why those are considered, equal level of importance as the Great Schism and, the Synod of Chalcedon, the Council of Chalcedon. I think that's a very odd thing for them to include. But anyway, that's a nitpick. That's me being very nitpicky. But anyway, so I've just taken it back quickly so we can hear this initial statement again.
Let's unpack that. First, in the simplest sense, any Christian community in Britain before the Great Schism of 1054 is by definition part of what we now call the Orthodox Church. They confess the Nicene Creed, they recognise the same ecumenical councils, they celebrated the same sacraments, baptism, Eucharist, priesthood, confession, and holy unction, they venerated saints and relics, they fasted and lived a strongly sacramental and liturgical life.
Okay. Again, he says the Church of the First Millennium was undivided and thus West and East were Orthodox. If that's his perspective, that's okay, but it's sort of not... it doesn't prove anything. Everyone knows that the First Millennium Church was Orthodox. As a Catholic, I can equally claim, as I said before, the First Millennium Church to be Catholic. And if I want to be pedantic, I'll just mention that there were, between 323 and 852 Anno Domini. This is noted by doctorate and priest Father Adrian Fortescue, who notes that there were 5 separate schisms in that period of 323 to 852. This is just between Rome and Constantinople, and these schisms added up to 203 years out of 529. In each of these schisms, Fortescue notes that Rome was vindicated, and both churches together agree that Rome was correct on the occasions of all these schisms. These schisms were the Arian crisis, Rome's support of St. John Chrysostom, contrary to the Constantinople, the Acacian Schism, the Monothelite Schism, and the Iconoclastic Schism. But that's me being pedantic again. Outside of such schisms, Euan is right in that the undivided Church of the First Millennium from west to east was Orthodox. But it was also Catholic, which Eastern Orthodox shouldn't disagree with because they're the Orthodox Catholic Church anyway. But it's sort of weird to claim exclusivity of one term but not the other. I think that's odd. Now I've just pulled Father Adrian's book up. This is an online copy. I apologise for that noise. This is an online copy, but I have an actual copy right here. Really good book. It's old, obviously, but so is the church history. But as you can see here, we can see all the different councils. So 55 years during the Arian troubles, 11 years in schism because of St. John Chrysostom's being deposed, 35 years during the Acacian Schism, 41 years because of monothelitism. This is also where Rome was with St. Maximus the Confessor, one of the great fathers of Orthodoxy, which is ironic, but anyway. 61 years schism because of iconoclasm, which is altogether 203 years out of 529. And every single one of those Constantinople was on the wrong or heretical side, and every one, Eastern and Western Christians now agree that Rome was right. Such continual breaches gradually weakened the bond of the church eventually, which led to the Great Schism. I apologise because I've taken this back again. Without further ado, here's the section I want to address.
It's the Nicene Creed. They recognised the same ecumenical councils. They celebrated the same sacraments, baptism, Eucharist, priesthood, confession, and holy unction. They venerated saints and relics. They fasted and lived a strongly sacramental and liturgical life.
Now, this is sort of an odd claim. Like, to say that the English Church was Orthodox because it confessed the Nicene Creed, recognised the ecumenical councils, had the same sacraments as the Orthodox Church today, venerated icons and relics, fasted and lived a strongly sacramental and liturgical life. Yeah, and everything you said there could be applied equally to modern Catholicism or medieval Catholicism. Today at Mass we say the Nicene Creed. We fast on Fridays. We follow the ecumenical councils more than these guys did, but that's because hadn't been held yet. We venerate icons and relics. We live a sacramental and liturgical life. This isn't saying anything. There's no exclusivity to what he's saying. He's just simply saying over and over generic practices shared by East and West, but he's using it to prove the East and ignoring the West. I don't get it. All he's really said basically is that the English Church, because it was part of the Universal Church, was Orthodox. This isn't exactly a strong claim. Anyway.
Words, if you took an ordinary Orthodox Christian from, say, the 7th century Constantinople and plonked him down in a church in Wales or Northumbria, he would absolutely recognise what's going on. The language and some of the customs would feel different, but the faith itself would be exactly the same. So out of this...
Okay. I do take a little bit of an issue with this. I think he's technically correct in this, but it's a really broad kind of correctness. If I took a peasant from 7th century Constantinople and put him in the church in Wales or Northumbria, as you said, the only thing familiar to that Orthodox peasant, that Greek peasant I should say rather, would be that, what would be Orthodox is a Greek liturgy, the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, the liturgy of St. James, liturgy of St. Basil. They may have heard stories of Latin or Syriac or Coptic clergy and liturgies, but they'd be stories. They'd be unfamiliar to such a peasant. Now, that's not to say they wouldn't recognize them as being in communion with them or being Christian, but it seems like a bit of a stretch to say that they'd immediately recognize Wales or Northumbrian churches as being Eastern Orthodox or Byzantine. Now, again, Euan does say that the liturgy and language would be different. So, again, what makes pre-schism orthodoxy different from pre-schism Catholicism? Just asserting repeatedly that the faith was the same isn't saying very much when the First Millennium Church, to a Roman Catholic, also looks very Catholic.
Foundational level, to say that Britain was Orthodox is simply to say the Christianity of early Britain was not Protestant, not modern Roman Catholic, nor secular. It was
Okay. Euan says that Britain wasn't modern Roman Catholic. I'd appreciate some definitions by what he means modern Roman Catholic. And I'd also appreciate definitions as to what Orthodox means. Does modern Roman Catholic mean lacking ecumenical councils that came after the schism? Does it mean lacking the Novus Ordo? Does it mean lacking the Rosary? This is a redundant conclusion. This was like saying that the pre-schism British Church wasn't Orthodox because they didn't venerate St. Gregory Palamas or St. Nicholas II. Practices exist in time, not outside of it. The pre-schism Church didn't have tchotkis either, and modern Eastern Orthodox do. Now, by this token, they're clearly not the same church. Obviously, I'm being fastidious. And I should note as well that prayer ropes and beads were used in the pre-schism Church in England, but guess what? They're used after the schism too, and they're still used today in both the Eastern and Western Catholic Church. The prayer tools used in pre-schism Britain were used primarily for praying the Psalms, Lord Prayers, and Ave Marias, not the Jesus Prayer, with this hesychastic practice only really developing in Eastern Orthodoxy in around the 12th to 14th century. This sort of, the chotki and all that sort of stuff would be completely unfamiliar to a Catholic in, I'm going to use that term, a Catholic in Britain before the schism. The prayer chords used in Britain were more common in Ireland than England, and they're referred to as paternoster chords, named so because the faithful would pray the paternoster, the Our Father, instead of the Psalms, often due to their own illiteracy. Like, a lot of the stuff he's saying so far, it's not really exclusive. I apologize also if I'm squinting. I literally have a torch set up as a light for my face, so anyway. But even today, the Catholic Church in England and Wales, they still fast. They're actually stricter than my own church in Australia does. Is so. The church in England and Wales still prays. They still have and believe in the seven sacraments, profess the Nicene Creed, venerate icons and relics, and live a strongly sacramental and liturgical life. So, what makes the present Catholic Church in England and Wales different from the pre-schism Catholic Church in England and Wales? Because those were the foundational level that he says defines the pre-schism Catholic Orthodox Church. What makes it Orthodox and not Catholic? It's just, I know I'm being pedantic and harsh, but he's just sort of asserting things without actually giving evidence for them.
The same ancient patristic Christianity that the Orthodox Church still preserves. So that's the baseline, but we can go further because there are some very striking indications that Britain wasn't just generally old Christian, it was also deeply connected to the Christian East. A really important point.
Okay, we have something to build on. Euan wants to establish Orthodoxy in Britain as having a connection to the Christian East. Now, this is actually a fair claim to make, to some extent. Britain and Ireland, from what we know, were indeed influenced by the Christian East, particularly in their early forms of monasticism. Now, this doesn't mean they were Orthodox in our modern understanding of the term, that is, Eastern Orthodox. And it's not exactly an exclusive thing. Much of Europe was influenced by the Christian East, including their liturgies. The Mozarabic, Gallican, Celtic, and Ambrosian liturgies, each likely have a heritage that's either Antiochian, Alexandrian, or potentially Ephesian. But unfortunately, the origins of liturgy, both East and Western, is incredibly murky and has very little scholarly consensus. This is in part because there were really very few standard liturgies at the time, particularly in the first half of the millennium. The Celtic Irish Rite had multiple iterations, periods, orderings from the time of St. Patrick onwards. The first iteration had more Roman influence and standardization within themselves. The second had a great variety in masses as the region was converted to the faith and presumably adopted many local customs and flavours. And the third was the most disorganized with a great diversity of rules, monastic tonsures, calculations for Easter, and, different moral rules and sinful rules. And this is after a fairly structured attempt to convert Ireland to the faith. For the Christians living in Ireland before St. Patrick, if there were any, which there probably were, they would have been just anarchic basically when it comes to the liturgy and theology and whatnot. All the stuff that happened with those first, second, and third orders, that was all within 225 years. Prior to St. Patrick, we know very little about their worship, and it's improper to speculate. But it goes, that's all Ireland.
One that often gets brushed aside is how early Christianity actually reached Britain, and via whom. Writers like Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century and beginning of the 3rd already speak of the gospel having reached beyond the reach of Roman rule.
Now, Euan notes that according to Tertullian, the Christian faith reached beyond Roman rule. This is one of my gripes with him, that he doesn't source or cite anything he says. I know it's a YouTube video, but like you're making fairly bold claims. So it'd be nice to cite it. I'm not gonna condemn him for not doing so, but it would have been nice. I'm going to be citing. I'll put sources in the description. But I believe I've found the source that he's referring to from Tertullian. For real. So the quote from Tertullian, it's completely true. The faith had spread throughout the whole world, from Ireland and Tarshish to India, and eventually through the Nestorians to China. So, the entirety of Eurasia. Further proof of this, we have evidence of British clergy at the First Council of Arles. This was one of the first councils held after Christianity's legalization, and this indicates that there was some sort of organization there. How united and universally British Christianity was part of the broader church is questionable, though. So right here we can see this is the British signatories to the Council of Arles. So it's Boreas, Bishop of the City of York in the province of Britain, Restatutus, Bishop of the City of London in the province above Britain, Adelphius, Bishop of the City Colonia Londensium, Sacerdotes, Priest, Arminius, Deacon. So we can see that there are British hierarchy of some level prior to St. Augustine going to Britain. Now, I'm going to be a little bit unfair here and bring up something that's not strictly relevant to the video, but I brought up the Council of Arles, so I'll mention it anyway. The Council of Arles, as we can see here in this section, heretics are forbidden from rebaptism. So if a person is a heretic and wishes to join the broader communion of the church, if they're baptized into the Trinity, they're chrismated or confirmed as a reception to the church. This is contra to the North Africans, the Donatists, who rebaptize anyone coming into the church. What the Council of Arles decides, and what the church itself does later as well, is follow the impression that if someone believes in the Trinity and they were baptized into the Trinity, they're fine. They get chrismated and confirmed. But if they don't know the Trinity, or they weren't baptized into the Trinity, then they get baptized. Now, the reason I bring that up, again, I'm being a bit pedantic. The reason I bring this up is because in 1971, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, they say, having this circumstance in mind, and also the current growth of this ecumenical heresy, which attempts to completely erase the difference between Orthodoxy and any heresy as manifested by the Moscow Patriarchate's decision, in spite of the Holy Councils, even to permit Roman Catholics to take communion in certain cases, the Bishops' Council deemed it necessary to introduce a stricter practice, to baptize all heretics who come into the church. Any other practice, the acceptance of Roman Catholics and Protestants baptized in the name of the Trinity into the church, through a strict repudiation of their heresy in the sacrament of chrismation, may only be permitted if strictly necessary. So, I ask Euan here, will the bishops attending Arles recognise ROCOR's rebaptism of heretics, or would they condemn it? Donatism, the source of ROCOR's teachings, was expressly condemned throughout the First Millennium Church, and yet ROCOR persists in it. It was condemned by the council we just read. Now, of course, not all ROCOR parishes rebaptize Catholics and Protestants, but that is quite explicitly rebaptism. You've got the Council of Arles. It's not a binding council, but it's still saying don't baptize any heretics who are baptized into the Trinity. And then we've got here ROCOR saying baptize heretics even if they're baptized into the Trinity. It's just a little bit out of step with the historic church. Back to the gospel spreading throughout the world. That was a bit of a sidetrack, I apologise. Now, and sort of unrelated as well. Now, firstly, we know very little in Irish Christian practice and worship prior to St. Patrick. Similarly, we know very little British worship prior to St. Augustine of Canterbury. Even after St. Patrick established the church in Ireland, the worship and uniformity fragmented, as stated prior. This is likely true of the Pre-Augustinian church in Britain, fragmented, disorganised and disunified. Now, this organisation was precisely the role that St. Augustine dedicated himself to, including standardising moral teaching, liturgies, and other such necessities of Christian life. Is it truly proper to say that the church was in Britain if the faith she confessed was fragmented, different, and often isolated? For this reason, I believe it's appropriate and proper to refer to St. Augustine as the founder of the church in Britain, precisely because he solved, or rather begun to solve, these problems of disunity. It's also worth noting that when that quote was said by Tertullian, Christianity was still a greatly persecuted faith. Widespread uniformity in orthodoxy, that is, right belief, was difficult to enforce by the church, and ought to be of little surprise that later Christians, like St. Augustine, were vested with the power to root out heterodoxy and preach the gospel, even though this is a land that had already, in some sense, heard the message of the gospel. But as the church was fragmented, disunified, it's unfortunate reality that the gospel was probably perverted in some sense. Not to a great extent. I'm sure they still celebrate liturgy and whatnot, but they may have been Arians. They may have been whatever else, and even at best, they were simply fragmented, and St. Augustine came in to fix that. For instance, think about the Arian crisis in the rest of the church. Arianism festered away under the same persecution that the church experienced. It was not until Christianity was legalized at the Edict of Milan that such a virus could begin to be treated. After Britain withdrew from Roman rule, or rather Roman withdrew from its British rule, and Britain descended into anarchy only 95 years later, being invaded by pagan tribes which further stifled Christianity in the uniformity of beliefs. So even if there were Christians in Britain prior to St. Augustine, it wasn't really much of a church. It was just sort of bishops and priests sort of doing their best to nourish their faithful, and sometimes falling into heresy, most likely. I will admit I don't have proof of that they're falling into heresy, but it doesn't seem quite unlikely if there was such disunity. Okay, so this is going to be a longer section, so we'll just let this play out.
In other words, into parts of the island that weren't even fully under Roman administration yet. Why does this matter? Because it means the faith here wasn't simply a neat top-down project whereby Rome decides, right, it's time to Christianise the barbarians and sends Augustine of Canterbury, and that's the whole story. Even before Augustine, there were already Christians in Britain, worshipping Christ, keeping the sacraments and producing their own saints and martyrs. If the gospel arrived here so early and not purely through official Roman channels, it is entirely plausible, and even likely, that some of those influences came by other routes. Merchants and sailors travelling from Gaul and Spain, soldiers and traders who themselves had roots from the Levant and Egypt, and the general circulation of Christians within the wider Roman world, which was not divided into neat Roman versus Eastern categories the way we now imagine. Archaeology also backs this up.
Okay. Technically, he's wrong about the province system of Rome, because it was right about the time of Constantine that the church was literally divided into Eastern and Western, but it wasn't neat. It was just sort of administrative. I'll forgive that. But anyway, my biggest problem with this section is that Euan conflates Roman influence and sola Romana, or sola Roma, I should say. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say, in any document I've read, any book I've read, even on social media, I've never seen anyone say, no, of course there were no Christians in England and Wales prior to St. Augustine. So we see here, this is from Documents Illustrated of English Church History by Henry G. and William John Hardy. From everything I can find, these guys are Anglican, so no bias here between Catholic or Catholic, you know. And I'll try to tell bias wherever it arises. So this is from the Answers of Gregory the Great to St. Augustine of Canterbury. It's just general questions regarding like church governance. When Augustine gets to Britain, how's he going to run the church? What do I have to do? So here we get section where it's like Augustine says, you know, what mass should we celebrate? Pope Gregory says it doesn't really matter so much. If you have found anything either in the Roman Church or that of the Gauls or any other church which may be more acceptable to Almighty God, you carefully make choice of the same and sedulously teach the Church of the English, which as yet is new in the faith, whatsoever you can gather from these several churches. So you know, just general stuff like that. Now, the thing that's interesting, because I was just talking about how, you know, there's no one who says that there were no English English faithful in Britain before Augustine. Even Augustine himself notes that there are bishops of Britain. Now, Pope Gregory, he gives the response that you don't have any authority over the Gallic bishops. You're just doing Britain. Because he says that the Bishop of Arles, he received the pall in ancient times from the prior popes, from his predecessors, and because the pall has given him authority and the previous popes have given him authority, they're not depriving him of that authority. And again, this is the Bishop of Arles. We just talked about Arles, the council, the synod. Anyway, Pope Gregory then goes on to say, "But as for all the bishops of Britain, we commit them all to your care, that the unlearned may be taught, the weak strengthened by persuasion, and the perverse corrected by authority." So, quite clearly, A, Gregory and Augustine know that there are bishops already in England and that there's faithful already in England naturally then. B, this is sort of further proof of the idea that I proposed, which was that the English Church has some heresy and heterodoxy and just general disorganization. And so I think it's fair to say that when people mean the foundation of the British Church was done by Augustine, They're referring to its organisation. For too long, these various bishops, priests, and deacons had been living in a disconnected region, persecuted by Roman pagans or by Anglo-Saxon pagans later, or they just simply lived in different kingdoms or monasteries. As we see here, I won't go into the details, it's fairly boring. St. Gregory organises Britain into several dioceses. This doesn't sound very conciliar if you ask me, but anyway. We don't believe, as a Catholic, we don't believe in conciliar church. This is a question for the Orthodox as to how a conciliar church could allow foreign bishops to, or rather, a foreign bishop to divide the diocese and priests and appoint one. So Gregory the Great sent Augustine to facilitate this organisation of the church in Britain and the organisation of these new dioceses. And this settled the disconnect, basically. And so for this reason, we say that this marks the beginning of the church in Britain. Not in her fruitfulness or her faith, but just simply as a church that could breathe all her priests and bishops, not in short, painful, interrupted breaths. Further, St. Augustine was sent to convert the now extant pagan Anglo-Saxons as well, who were by this stage quite sizable, having conquered many of the Roman and the native Celtic peoples. And we see here again that Euan talks. I've recorded ahead a little bit, but he talks about how Eastern practices came to Britain during this period, which again I agree with.